All right, targeting is all about how do you get the right information to the right people at the right time. Thus far in our conversation, we've been very focused on how do you organize information and how do people consume it. Now we're talking about how do we push it to people. Now, for most folks, you say, well, this is a little different than most information architecture. That's very true. Most of information architecture is dealing with allowing people access to timeless information. That is, information that's around for a long time. It doesn't have a fixed expiration. What targeting is about is really flipping that model over and talking about timely information, information that has some sort of a fixed timeline. And the big difference here is that we are now talking about push versus pull. When we're talking in the last module about navigation and search, we're talking about people pulling the information they want. They're going out and they're finding an article or a policy or a procedure, something that they want. Now, what we're talking about in targeting is really pushing the content to people. So on the intranet homepage, what things do we push to people, and how do we think about that in the broader context of information architecture? To understand that, we've got to talk about what an intranet is. And if you think about an intranet, there's a top-level view that you can say, well, it's a portal, it's navigation, it's application, so it's stuff that are web applications built into an intranet, and then it's content, it's all the news and articles and artifacts. So here, we'll be talking about the news and less about the articles, because those are timeless information, and that's what we've been working on for most of this course. When it gets down to news, news has changed. It used to be, in Ben Franklin time days, that you published an almanac, and that included some information, and it was news-ish, but it came out monthly or maybe weekly. Well, then newspapers came out, and the web press came, and now we have them daily. So newspapers could be printed daily, and we were great that we were getting information so up to date. Then, when radio and TV came about, well, heck, it got even faster yet. And we suddenly had CNN, cable news network, and now they started a headline news, and that's all great, but we've moved even beyond that, where most of us consume our news through email and websites. That's the way we get it. Now, in most organizations, the way that we communicate news is still very much historical, right? So we have these weekly or monthly newsletters that we send out, or maybe we send out daily emails. But we are thinking about news in a very historical way versus the way that people consume most news in today's world. So what does this mean? How do I get the news I need and not have to listen to a bunch of noise? Well, that's all about signal-to-noise ratio. In other words, how much information is it that we're getting that we want, and how much are we having to filter out ourselves? Our goal in doing information architecture and in doing targeting is to reduce the noise and increase the signal. We want only the things that are important to people to go up to be shown to them, and none of the stuff that isn't. Well, it's a great goal, but it's hard to get there. Well, why would we do that? Well, the answer is because we have an information overload problem. If you think back to the very beginning of this course, we talked about how much more content is being created. We're talking about the fact that 53% of people believe that less than half the information they get is valuable. They feel like they're getting the wrong information. They've just got too much going on, and 4,000 advertisements in a day. So targeting is our solution to how information gets pushed to people. If we push everything to all of the employees, well, then they're all going to get stuff that's not relevant. If I'm in LA and there's a new parking policy in New York, well, I don't care. So there are three ways to do targeting. There's three ways to get targeting into people's sphere of influence. And the first is called in-part personalization. And that means that individually inside a web part, inside of a block on the page, a portlet, whatever you want to call it, inside of that block, we filter what's shown to you. So in the case of news, we filter only the news, which matches some attribute of yours. The second type is web part or portlet targeting, and that is only show this portlet if there's something about the user that makes them interested in it. So if I had a web part that was specific for managers, I'd filter it so that it is only shown to managers. I'd target it. The last option, and this is rarely used, but you could create personal pages for every single person, and they could drag and drop and add web parts and so on and so forth. The reason this is rarely used is because it creates some support issues, and additionally, it's very hard to push the information that the organization needs the employees to see if everybody can change whether they see it or not. So I've been focused here on communication for a bit, and I want to say that this is important to organizations because it improves their labor cost, both in terms of productivity, but also in terms of turnover. Employees who are communicated with better simply don't turn over as fast. There's lots of research, and I won't bore you with it, but I'll say that communication satisfaction, and there's a standardized questionnaire, has a high correlation or relationship to employee satisfaction. Employee satisfaction, in turn, means that employees turn over less frequently. Less turnover, less labor cost, because each turnover is between 20 and 150% of the first year salary of somebody. So there's a big savings if you can just communicate with everyone effectively. Before we leave targeting, how do you define it? How do you know how many attributes to use and how many values? Well, the trick is to keep it simple, stupid. The idea is that we want to find a set of targeting that increases the signal-to-noise ratio, but isn't so difficult it's impossible to configure. Think about it for a minute. If you have 20 areas or locations and 20 departments and 3 organization levels, you create potentially 1,200 combinations of targeting. We're trying to not make it too complicated. 1,200 might be an okay number, but as you add more and more dimensions and more values, you have to consider that it's hard to predict what will happen as you feed the engine, you feed the targeting engine, what users will see.